Could you survive on bread laced with grit, so hard you had to soak it just to chew? Contrast that with a feast where peacocks arrived refeathered, drenched in sauces thick with spices that cost a fortune. This incredible divide wasn't a story. It was the everyday reality of medieval Europe. What landed on your plate, or the rough-hewn trencher beneath it, depended entirely on rank. The difference wasn't just taste, it was a chasm separating survival from staggering excess. Join us as we explore the fascinating, and frankly sometimes repulsive, truth about food and status in the Middle Ages. Medieval Europe was a world rigidly divided by social class, and nowhere was this division clearer than on the dinner plate, or lack thereof. For the vast majority, around 90% of the population, the peasants, serfs, and laborers, life was a constant struggle for sustenance. Their diet was dictated by the seasons, the local harvest, and the heavy hand of their landlords. The absolute cornerstone of the poor person's diet was bread. But forget the soft, fluffy loaves we know today. This was dark, heavy bread made from rye, barley, or oats, often mixed with beans or peas as filler. It was frequently coarse, poorly milled, and sometimes contained grit from the millstones or even chaff swept up from the floor. Baking might only happen once a week or even less frequently, resulting in bread that became incredibly hard and stale, needing to be soaked in whatever liquid was available just to be edible. Alongside bread, the other daily staple was pottage. Think of a thick, perpetually simmering stew or porridge cooked over the hearth fire in a single pot. The base was usually grains like oats or barley, thickened with whatever vegetables were available from the cottage garden or foraging. Onions, leeks, cabbage, turnips, carrots. Herbs might add some flavor. Meat was a rare luxury. If a peasant family owned a pig, it was a prized possession, usually slaughtered in the autumn. The meat would be carefully preserved through salting or smoking to last through the winter. Chickens provided eggs and the occasional scrawny bird for the pot. But what about hunting? Surely the forests were full of game. While true, hunting rights almost always belonged exclusively to the nobility. Poaching deer or boar from the lord's land carried severe penalties, sometimes even death. Peasants might trap small birds or rabbits if they dared, but large game was strictly off-limits. Fish could supplement the diet if they lived near rivers or the coast, but even fishing rights were often controlled. Dairy products like cheese and butter were consumed, but milk itself wasn't drunk as commonly as we might imagine. It was often considered food for the very young or the sick, and much of it was turned into longer-lasting cheese or butter. Drinks were simple: water, often drawn from potentially unsafe sources, and weak ale or cider. Ale was a caloric staple, brewed at home, but it was usually low in alcohol content compared to modern beers. Life for the poor revolved around the agricultural calendar. A good harvest meant survival. A bad harvest, often caused by drought, flood, or pests, meant hunger, malnutrition, and the very real threat of starvation. But what happened when the harvest failed? The consequences were truly terrifying, leading to widespread famine where thousands perished. Communities were devastated, and people resorted to desperate measures simply to stay alive. This constant precariousness defined the peasant experience. Now, let's climb the social ladder and enter the world of the medieval nobility. If the peasant's diet was about survival, the noble's diet was about status, abundance, and conspicuous consumption. Meat was king. While peasants might taste meat occasionally, nobles ate it almost every day, often in staggering quantities and varieties. Lavish feasts featured multiple courses, each laden with different types of meat. Roasted beef, pork, mutton, and venison were common. But exotic fare demonstrated true wealth. Swan, peacock, crane, heron, boar's head. These weren't just cooked, they were presented dramatically. Peacocks might be roasted, then carefully reskinned and feathered for display. Boars' heads were paraded into the hall. Sauces were rich and numerous, often thickened with breadcrumbs. Fish was also consumed in large quantities, partly due to the church. The medieval calendar was filled with fast days, Fridays, Saturdays, Lent, and various vigils, where meat was forbidden. But this was hardly a hardship for the rich. Their tables groaned with expensive freshwater and sea fish, pike, salmon, trout, carp, eels, sturgeon, Even whale and porpoise, classified as fish back then, these were prepared in elaborate ways, baked, fried, jellied, or put into pies. The bread on a noble's table was the complete opposite of the peasant's loaf. It was manchet bread, made from the finest, whitest wheat flour, sieved multiple times to remove any bran or impurities. This white bread was so symbolic of status that leftover slices, or even specially made flat loaves called trenchers, were used as edible plates to soak up the juices and sauces. At the end of the meal, these sauce-soaked trenchers were often given as charity to the poor waiting outside the castle gates, a literal trickle-down of leftovers. And then there were the spices. In a world without refrigeration, spices help preserve food and mask the taste of meat that might be slightly off. But more importantly, they were outrageously expensive. Originating in the Far East and traveling treacherous trade routes, spices like pepper, cloves, nutmeg, cinnamon, ginger, mace, and especially saffron, used for its vibrant yellow color as much as its flavor, were potent symbols of wealth and connection. Noble kitchens used spices with abandon, creating flavors that might seem overpowering to us today. Imagine a world where pepper was worth more than gold. That was the reality for medieval spice lovers, and lacing dishes heavily with these costly powders shouted wealth from the rooftops. Sweets were also part of the noble diet. Honey was a common sweetener, but imported cane sugar was the real luxury item, used in elaborate desserts, pastries, candied fruits, and jellies. Fresh fruits, especially those that didn't grow locally like oranges or figs, were imported at great cost. To wash it all down, the rich drank wine, often imported from France or Spain, alongside high-quality, stronger ales. Spiced wine, known as hippocras, sweetened and flavored with ginger, cinnamon, and other exotic spices, was a particular favorite digestif after a heavy meal. Feasting wasn't just about eating, it was theater. Banquets could last for hours, featuring entertainment between courses, musicians, jesters, acrobats. Food presentation reached incredible heights. Subtleties were intricate sculptures made from marzipan, sugar paste, or wax, often depicting castles, animals, or allegorical scenes. Pies might be baked with live birds inside, ready to fly out when the crust was cut. Think your dinner parties are fancy? Medieval feasts involved edible sculptures and birds flying out of pies. It was all about displaying power, wealth, and generosity, even if that generosity mostly extended to other nobles. So the contrast is stark. Peasants ate monotonous diets of coarse bread, pottage, and seasonal vegetables, with meat as a rare treat. Nobles ate vast quantities of meat and fish, fine white bread, used expensive spices liberally, enjoyed sugary desserts, and drank wine. One diet was about calorie intake for hard labor and sheer survival. The other was about demonstrating status through variety, rarity, and sheer excess. The church's fasting rules applied to both, but the rich simply substituted meat with expensive fish and elaborate non-meat dishes, while the poor often had little choice but to eat even less. Did these vastly different diets affect their health? Absolutely. Peasants suffered from chronic malnutrition, vitamin deficiencies, like scurvy in winter, and were incredibly vulnerable during famines. Their coarse diet, however, might have meant less tooth decay than the sugar-consuming rich, and perhaps less gout. The wealthy, despite access to more food, faced their own problems. Obesity was common. Gout, a painful joint condition linked to rich diets high in meat and alcohol, was practically an aristocratic occupational hazard. Dental problems were rife due to sugary foods. While generally better nourished than the poor if they survived childhood diseases, their diet of excess brought its own set of painful health problems. You might think the rich had it all, but their diet came with its own set of painful health problems like debilitating gout. The food on a medieval table told you everything about the person eating it. It was a map of their place in the world, a world of harsh realities for the many and extravagant indulgence for the few. From gritty bread and watery ale to spiced peacock and imported wine, the gulf between rich and poor was defined by what and how much they ate. It reminds us that throughout history, food has been far more than just fuel. It's been power, status, survival, and a reflection of society itself. What we eat today seems worlds away, yet the echoes of status and availability still shape our food choices, perhaps more than we realize.